Hey everyone, this is Ian Cohen, founder and leader of Terra Education Technologies, back with another session of the Visionary School Founders Series. Very excited to talk with the co-founders of Dekalb Brilliance Academy, launching this fall 2022. We have 2 out of 3 founders here. We have Kedra Herbert and Jocelyn Alter. Thank you both for making it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
There's a third founder, Terri Knox, who is under the weather, couldn't make it, but as much as part of the piece of this founding team, as a former co-founder with 2 others, I know how important it is to make sure everyone gets brought into the picture. But Jocelyn and Kedra, very excited to talk with you today. One, because you're the first co-founders that we've chatted with during this series. And 2, because of the model of what Dekalb Brilliance Academy is trying to accomplish. It's a lot about real world application. And this is specifically for kids at the elementary level, which is something that most folks don't even think about, but I think is really commendable and exciting to see how it goes. So with that, I would love to get a little bit of background on each of your stories. The first question we'd like to ask is just tell us a little bit about yourself and what in your story led to this vision for Dekalb Brilliance Academy. And Kedra, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah. Well, just a little bit about myself. Again, Kedra Herbert, born and raised in Orlando, Florida. Prior to coming down to Atlanta, I was an educator up in New York, worked for one of a larger CMO, did some really dope work as a dean of students, as well as a teacher previously, as well as an academic dean. And in my time, mostly as a dean of students, I just really wanted to ensure that schools felt like a very safe place for kids, one that felt equitable, fair, where kids felt loved, known, and cared about. In the community that they were entrenched in was one that like really wrapped their arms around our kids. And then back in January, actually before January, back in October, in our country, it was the large resignation that was happening. And in that time, I was really pondering what were going to be my next steps. And for me, I just really wanted to join an organization or either create one that was very much in tune with being human-centered, that care for the whole child, but also one that actually care for the whole person. And when I say that, I mean the big people in our building too, like our teachers, as well as the community in which we work and partner with, as well as joining an organization that was rooted in co-design. Because up until that point in my career, that was like never a thing. The charter schools would literally just move into the communities. And it was kind of like, we're your best option. And that's it. And when I had an opportunity to connect with Jocelyn and learn about some of the work that she had already started prior to Terri and I absolutely just fell in love with the fact that we actually could build a school with the community. Because to me, that was very much unheard of, especially in a climate like New York, where there are so many charter schools. And oftentimes it is like, we are the best thing for you versus you are the community. You come in with your own level of expertise and perspective. And so we're going to honor that and work with you. And that was very awe-inspiring to me. And it's like more heads are better than one. So seeing what has been created already, just with family input, staff input, and just this like beautiful shared model, I'm just like enamored, but I'm just exceptionally proud of what people can do when they all come together and really work together to design something that is beautiful.
Yeah, a couple follow-ups to that, but I'm going to let Jocelyn chime in first. But yeah, I mean, it's also builds that investment, right? I mean, if you want to be an institution in a community, then the community needs to have some investment in building from the ground up, and it's such a huge opportunity when you're starting from scratch. Jocelyn, I'd love to hear your side of the story and what led you to this vision for Dekalb Brilliance Academy.
Totally. So my name is Jocelyn Alter. I have 15 years of experience in education. And, if you looked at my resume, you'd see that I sort of ping ponged all over the field. And I think that that's because since my very first teaching experience, have been looking for something that's been pretty hard to find. So my first teaching experience was in a pre-K in a high school. So it's for parenting high school students once they've had a child to be able to finish their high school degree and get the support they need for their family. And so there was a lot that was really incredible about that program. But one thing was everyone was in the same building all the time, right? So the kids and the parents were together in the same school building. And so there would be these times that, a parent would have a study hall or a lunch or, something like that. And they'd come by and you get to see them for 45 minutes. This is before I was a parent myself, but, you'd get to see the way they when they're talking about something that's really important to the kid, that they get so close that their heads are literally touching, or, when, the parent is leaving, how often they're looking back over their shoulder, or when they're stressed because their kid is upset, their shoulders are the whole way up in their ears. And I think for me, it was this preview into how physically scary, how viscerally vulnerable it is to leave your child somewhere every day and hope and pray that they're nurtured.
Right.
And Kedra, I've been seeking organizations that are reverent of children, that revere them for these incredible, unique, fantastic, amazing, magical creatures that we have the privilege of being able to grow into the best version of whatever they are.
Right.
And I have met a lot of individual educators like that, tons of individual educators that's the way they're oriented.
Yeah, sure.
I have not worked in a lot of organizations, but that's the way they're oriented, because organizations are replicating our society and all of the issues around white dominant culture and all the things that go with that. And so it's not surprising that organizations don't replicate that, but I think that I kept going at all these different angles to try to get into education in a different way that would honor our young folks, that would treat our families as experts on their own children, that would say this job is too big to do alone. We should do it, like Kedra was saying, with community, not to community. And I was in a lot of spaces where I was doing it to community.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that was for me really what was in the dream of Dekalb Brilliance before it had this name, didn't have this name, was to go to a community that wanted a school, first of all, to ask, where do folks want a school?
Yeah.
And in South Dekalb, we heard this very strong yes, because folks are driving, and our co-founder does this herself. Terri does this herself, drives her kids across the city to get to a school that she feels is the right choice for her
Right.
children, because there are no charter options south of I-20 in Atlanta at all. And so we heard this very strong, yes, please, in Dekalb. And then when we started to ask folks, well, what should school be? What should the purpose of school be? We were sort of unsurprisingly blown away by the ideas. I really wish that these ideas in our school model were mine. That would be so wonderful. And I would feel very proud of them. They are not. And they are they show, again, what Kedra was saying around when you do this as a collective, it is just inherent that you have more wisdom and you can do better by kids. And so that is something that really the theory around is this, or the question around, is this possible, has over the last 3 years of founding really been proven out that yes, not only is it possible, but we can do better by kids and better by families when we do it.
Yeah, no, that's great context. And it sounds like, that community involvement, engagement is maybe the most critical thing to y'all's model and your all approach. It's clear that that's super important. And I'm going to ask a question about that. I do want to point out for people who are watching, I don't think a lot of people know how long it takes to start a school. You guys are about to launch this fall, 2022, and finally get students and parents and everybody in the building. but this is a multi-year process. You know, if you want to start an LLC, you could do it right now in 15 minutes, right? You can start a company, go on Secretary of State website, you do it. But starting a school is not a quick thing, and it shouldn't be either. But I think I wanted to again applaud you all, especially through this time of making it this far. So one thing I do want to ask, this is deviating from my normal questions, but this comes up a lot with some of the founders we talk to. There's this growing theme of like, we want to engage the community, get them invested in the founding process. I think there's a lot of merit in that, and obviously there's tons of benefits. One thing I want to ask, from you're both experienced educators, what does that process look like in practice? So if you could give me a couple of examples of like, okay, how do you actually engage a community as you found a school? And then beyond that, how do you balance your expertise as educators with the ideas that you get from community members? Like, where does that middle ground lie? Because obviously there's, you know, we want to look at ourselves as professionals with expertise, and we want to also incorporate what the community feels like their students need and what they want for their community. So what are a couple of the things y'all did to engage with the community on a practical side? And then how do you balance the suggestions with your own experiences?
Yeah, I can talk about like a programmatic example, and then Kedra is like leading a bunch around culture and social emotional learning that is like less baked, and so might be an even better example of like what it will look like moving forward.
Sure.
But like looking back, so we heard these, we have interviewed 1,000 community members about the school. And I think we're probably well above that now, but I at some point stopped tracking. But once we had that nice number, that was enough to track. But so I think we're well above that. And when we asked what should the purpose of school be, we heard these two big themes. One was like, make sure my kids know like what they're good at, what they're strong in, what they're interested in, like what they don't like, what they're not interested in. And then there's this other theme around the path for impact. And so some families frame that as like what career they should be in, what problem they could solve in the world, what leaders they could become, et cetera. But this path for impact, that's really where the name came from, this idea that this is about students' brilliance, making the world brighter and better, right? This is about students' internal strengths, having an impact. So we heard that from families, and then it was like, okay,
what does that look like?
Now, what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
And so what that meant, just from a process perspective, was that we did a lot of studying schools that, you know, had models around developing leaders. And so we did that at the like very, you know, sort of even graduate level to, unfortunately, there are very few elementary models around this, but, you know, to the sort of high school, occasionally middle school model. And then we came back to families and said, this is our draft of what we think the program is based on the parameters you've given us. What's right, what's not, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, at the beginning, like we were just going to have kids like do projects based on things they were interested in by themselves. Right. Families rightfully were like, well, you know, big problem with how leaders actually can do in the world is that they're not very good at working on teams. And so really, you should be working on, you know, how young folks are collaborating. And that was like vetted out in the research too. So, you know, there's sort of not a conflict there, but they pushed us in a different direction on that. And so it's a lot of like taking the parameters, going and looking at what the education expertise says around them, and then coming back and saying, is this what you meant? And then families, you know, push us differently. Similarly, like we were going to have kids choose what they were doing as far as the different careers they're exposed to. Families said like K4, we want a broad survey. So they're exposed to lots of things they might not know they like. And then in upper school, they can choose. And so there was, you know, a lot of that pushing as we came back again and again. But that's an example of something that's already baked, not something that like we're designing moving forward in the school year.
Right. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And before Kedra chimes in on the SEL front, I do also want to point out something that I think is really important that you said in the beginning. That even the question that you asked, what is the purpose of education? and purpose of school, like I think sometimes we gloss over the fundamental question, right? And I think
Right.
that's one of the reasons why people are so fatigued with K-12 right now. It's because we don't even have a clear vision for what that purpose is. So I think it's
We
brilliant.
didn't ask that at first, Ian. At first,
Oh,
we
really?
were just like, what do you want in school? And we weren't getting very, it was like better meals, you know, like the answer was very deep.
Right.
We
Better
should
meals
also
is
have
always
better meals, right? But it's like, yeah.
No, I think that's great. And the fact that you're going through a genuine design process with iterations and feedback and you know, et cetera, is amazing. And honestly, this in my mind is what the charter space is meant to be, right? It's giving you that latitude to do that. And hopefully, you know, not everybody does it that way, unfortunately, but it sounds like you guys are really committed to that process. So Kedra, on your front, when it comes to either the social emotional stuff that she was referring to, or something else about the model that's less baked, what can you say about the process and balancing expertise versus community input?
Yeah, I think just in general, it's about yes, like honoring, to our point, like the expertise of anyone that is in the room, and it's like also being rooted in what science or frameworks or research is like telling us is to also be true. And I think a part of that is also just like sharing our knowledge base with other stakeholders and being like transparent with why or why not we're doing something. Because oftentimes it's like, maybe it's like you think that we should be doing X, Y, and Z, and you just don't have like the context or the schema or whatever that knowledge is to see why we're making that decision. But my thing is like, if we're actually transparent with that up front and not allowing people to have to guess or create their own narratives, that just like helps build the trust, but also it helps build just like people's own internal knowledge. So one of the things that we're currently working on actually is taking our what we call our core skills, and we're building out our SEO programming with our families and our teachers. And we have a lot of like, you know, being in education yourself, there's so many different social emotional learning frameworks out there. It's like, how do you pick the right one? How do you make it mesh with your school? And so it just boils down to like, what are actually the things that we value as leaders, and what are the things that our community value, and how do we find the alignment, and then be able to build it out there. And so that has been a very fun process of trying to.
What are you smiling about? It sounds like something's coming to mind about this experience.
No, because when I came, it was trying to like mesh together, like, okay, I hear all this feedback, you know, from like our like board, I hear the feedback from families, I hear the feedback from like our own team, our co-founder team, I hear the feedback from our teachers. And then it's like, here's all this like research. And I came back and I was like, here's the product. And I laughed because I'm like, Jocelyn, Terri, I hear everybody feedback. I want it to work, and here's 10 different frameworks. And it was like, it was like, you ever seen on a MacBook how the little ball just like spins? I was like in that moment, a real representation of that ball.
That's funny.
And I laugh because I think a part of this like co-design model is like being comfortable with sitting in that uncomfortableness that like, I won't always have the answer, and I don't need to actually always have the answer, and that is okay.
Right.
And it's also being comfortable with the idea that we may not get it right the first time, and that is okay. I think, as you know, we're in like so many different equity fellowships. But one thing like stood out to me is that like perfectionism is like a symptom of like white dominant culture. And it's like your final product does not need to actually be the perfect version. And that,
right?
Yeah, it shouldn't be, but like, you know, we like live in this like society that tells us that we have to, because that
Right.
we live in a society that is driven by whiteness. And that's what whiteness tells us. And that was really hard for me. And I think it's, as someone that's like trying to like roll out and implement our SEL program, it's like, how do you boil down those things
Yeah.
to the core? And I think for us, it was just like, what are our principles? What are our values? And then pairing that with the most, the research that actually matches that. And again, it goes back to like just being okay with like, it's okay if we're not going to get it right.
Yeah. I mean, they say it in entrepreneurship all the time, if you aren't embarrassed by your first version of your product or service, then you launch too late, right? Like you need to just, we all know that you just need to get it out there and see what happens and do some real rigorous testing and feedback and iterations. And I think, it's one of those things that in the education space, we don't often give ourselves or each other the latitude in the traditional system to do things like that. And that's why so many people seem to be reluctant to change in the traditional school system, because, change means getting everybody to change stuff. I mean, there's so many. When I was a teacher, it was sort of the start of the SEL trend. And then they just, one day it was like, okay, teachers, here's the SEL thing you need to implement now on top of all your classes. And it was a very, blunt instrument, like nobody was trained, we didn't know how to do it. But to your point, like if we really want to develop new models, we need to give ourselves latitude to start with a rough version, see what happens. And, it's tough convincing communities that, I imagine, just because these are parents with kids and this is a serious thing. At the same time, as you said, if there's core values beneath everything and what you're trying to accomplish and you're transparent, I think that makes a ton of sense. And it's refreshing to hear, especially founders who are very open about, hey, I don't have this figured out yet, and we're going to work on this together, as opposed to trying to make it sound like everything's buttoned up and ready to go from day one, which it'll be as much as you can, but there's only a reasonable amount you can do that, right?
And some things have to be like, I think there's like you want, if the environment isn't predictable for families or kids, it's not going to feel safe. People aren't going to take risks. Like there's foundations around how young folks access mathematics and reading that we're very careful and explicit around. And we haven't let those things go. It's not like we are not doing those things. And so when a family says, my child's dyslexic and I'm really worried about them learning to read, we can say, like, here's the explicit, systematic way that we're teaching reading, and it will be exactly at his level, and we will get him, to be a proficient reader and all these things. And at the same time, he's going to work in these groups where he's accessing this really inspirational, exciting, problem-solving content that's going to make him want to read more. And so I think it's like, it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater either, right? It's like taking the things that we know work in schools and not getting rid of them, but saying, we know this foundation works and families are telling them it's not enough. So how can we use that foundation to build, the dream that families have asked us?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. So I want to transition to a question about teachers. At Terra, we're very teacher first. We think, and we obviously, everybody knows right now in the K-12 space, teachers as a profession, you call it a crisis, call it whatever you want, burnout, shortages. We all know the issues at hand, and we know that they've been around long before the pandemic. So I'd love to hear about, what do you all think are the biggest challenges facing teachers today broadly? And then how do you really plan on addressing it through your model at Dekalb Brilliance? And I'll let either of you to jump in on that one.
I'll take a whack at it. So over the last several months, we've been doing a lot of teacher hiring. As you know, we're staffing an entire school. And so it's been beautiful to connect with literally hundreds of teachers to see, like, why do you actually want to join our school? Because it's not like you're actually starting a new role. You're literally just changing the environment. And the thing that is abundantly clear is that folks are, a few things. It's like either I'm just like, I'm literally just spent, I'm burnt, I'm at my like brinking capacity, or there, that's like that bucket of folks. But then the other bucket is like, I'm in an environment where like I don't feel valued, I don't feel appreciated. My voice and the things that matter to me and as an educator is like not appreciated by the people that's in my building. Help. Like you have this like this co-design model, like what does this look like real time for teachers? And so I get to like illuminate the picture that I believe how it will play out at our school. So based off just like hundreds of folks that I've spoken to thus far, I believe those are the key things, as well as just what I've experienced myself as an educator. But at Dekalb Brilliance, like we do want to value the expertise that's in our building. Whether you have 3 years or 30 years of experience, like you come in with some wisdom and you come in with perspective. So similar to the way that we have family advisory council, we have staff advisory council where we bring important decisions to our teachers and let them actually like weigh in. And we've already started that process, even though like our teachers are not physically in the building and honestly have not even met our kids yet. But like their perspectives still matter to us, whether they're with us physically yet or not, and letting them know that. And then I think outside of that, making sure that we are like the same way that we want to nurture our kids' brilliance and their talents and their gifts and their skill sets, like we need to do that for our adult learners that's also in our building. So making sure that we have robust support plans. So at our school, we also have what we call learning partnership plans for our kids, but we will have like a grown-up version for our teachers. And so to help them to like cultivate their strengths and leverage them across our school. And then outside of that like structure, we've just also identified other things given the context that our teachers will be coming into our school with, what we call like a culture win plan. Is thinking about how we are going to cultivate a sense of community and collaboration and connection among our staff members, and how we, so that's like one. And then it's like building our team's capacity to be able to like operate in a system that is very much unlike the ones that they're currently coming from. Because for a lot of our teachers, and including ourselves as leaders, we come from organizations or schools that again are like driven by like whiteness and white supremacy. And so we have like a lot of unlearning to do as like leaders, as well as like supporting our teachers with that culture shift. So just being able to build our team's capacity to like lead for racial equity, but also to understand what liberatory practices are and how they live within our school model, both at the family and student level, but also at the grown-up level. So like making intentional time to like do that unlearning with them. And then being able to also, going back to like honoring the expertise, it's like building a robust pipeline for all of our teachers and leaders within our building. So for instance, like we have assistant teachers that can transition into teachers and residents. Our teachers and residents can transition into lead teachers. Our lead teachers can have various teacher leader opportunities, whether that is grade level chair, whether that is coaching new teachers as like a resident advisor. And the same thing for our leaders. It's like our development doesn't stop. It's like all three of us so far, we're all in like equity fellowships, because it's like we got to put our money where our mouth is. And so for saying that we're going to support our team with this shift, like we also have to like start doing that learning ourselves. So it's like at every level in our organization, there's opportunities for you to grow, and there's opportunities for you to be able to share your gifts with the collective. And then just on like a very like baseline level, just like making sure that we don't create, I'll call it like limit unforced stress for our teachers. And what that could, and what I mean by that is like just making sure that if we're saying that this is this ambitious model, not saying, okay, great, wonderful, we're gonna burn you out. And then when you get home, you need to go do everything that is that goes along with this, like family welcome visits, family phone calls, all of these planning, all prep and all this stuff. Like that needs to, for the most part, to the best of our human existence and possibility, like just like live within our school model and our school day. And then just try to limit the amount of unpredictability. Because like just removing them from being like teachers, they're humans first. And when the environment doesn't feel stable, when it doesn't feel loving or welcoming, like we automatically as humans just go into fight or flight. And we want people to feel like this is to the best of our ability, that we're creating something that feels predictable for them. And again, going back to what I was talking about with our families, like the times when something does need to shift, because at the end of the day, yes, we want to create predictability, but we're a startup. And so making sure that you proactively and like transparently communicate with people, because when you can give them the rationale, and honestly, when you're just honest, like it's just as simple as that. It's like sometimes like we try, like I feel like people, even as like leaders, like in previous organizations I worked in, like we like hide so much of the truth from people.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And it makes people's brains spiral versus just saying like, Ian, like we couldn't do this and this is why.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, well, like here are our resource constraints, or here's what the research, and it's like to your point about families too, right? Like the research says this about homework. This is why we don't do it. If you want more, here's the Khan Academy website. If you want to use it, that's up to you as a family, but here's why we don't do that as a school. And families are just not going to be like, well, that doesn't make, it makes sense. It's logical. But when we say like, we don't do homework at Dekalb Brilliance, full stop, you're creating this weird barrier where you're not sharing that. And similarly with our teachers, like Kedra literally went through our daily schedule with them and said, we have this many teachers, we have this much time, here are the demands around special education, et cetera. What would you want to see differently? What do you like? What do you want to see as we grow? And like just being that transparent totally changes the trust factor,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes complete sense. I mean, it's funny how quickly that breaks down in schools. And I think to Kedra's point, it's everybody goes in survival mode once things start getting chaotic. And if the leaders aren't able to stabilize the ship, and oftentimes to your point, stabilization and stability is grounded in communication, right? Like it doesn't mean you're going to have everything figured out, but if there's a clear flow of communication, that really is usually enough for, professionals to deal with. I know Jocelyn has to pop out of here. So I want to quickly transition to our last two questions. I'll let Jocelyn chime in first in case she needs to dip. And then Kedra, you can give me your thoughts. So I'm going to combine these questions. One is for any aspiring school founders out there, one piece of advice you might have. And then the second part is we very much want people to look forward into the future for K-12 and what that could look like. So if you think 10 years from now, what do you hope is true about K-12 more broadly 10 years from now in 2032? So Jocelyn, I'd love to get one piece of advice for aspiring school founders and then what you hope is true 10 years from now in K-12.
Yeah, I think my one piece of advice for aspiring school founders is to ask about everything you don't know and then ask about the things you think you do know, because it's been like this sort of most humbling and empowering experience of my life outside of motherhood, in that like it has totally redefined who I am in a really good way. But like that required me being open to that kind of transformation, and looking down the road, I hope young folks are empowered to lead their own educations. That's what I want.
Great. Fair enough. Well, I appreciate both of that. Kedra, do you have any differing advice or additional advice, I should say?
My advice is more from the human sense of just showing yourself and others around you an immense amount of grace. I've been in education for a decade, and some of the things that I'm experienced, to Jocelyn's point, I am humbled. I'm like, oh my God, I thought I knew this. Oh my God. Like, like you have this like moment, like,
Yeah.
and you like, or at least like sometimes my default is like to beat myself down, when it's actually like, you actually didn't know this. And even if you knew like a snippet, is a very different context that you're working in. So like show yourself grace, one, because like we need to forgive ourselves for when things don't go right.
Yeah.
And when we can operate from a sense of our own humanity and from a sense of like just loving and nurturing ourselves, we can then translate that to other people. Because when our people come into our organizations, they're going to need grace too. Like this is going to be equally as hard for them. And so I always say, start out with grace. And then what I want to be true for the world of K-12 education is schools that are allowing kids to really take charge of their education, and schools that are partnering with communities are not the anomaly. Like I want that in 10 years to be like the norm, because it shouldn't just exist in the bubble. We've had of just the privilege of going to these amazing schools across our country and being able to observe them. And right now they are the anomaly. I'm like, why is this not the standard? For kids being able to drive their educational experience, for teachers to feel empowered, for leaders to work with communities to really think outside of the box of what education can be. And so I just want it to be the norm and not think like in a bubble.
No, I love that. Well, this has been inspiring, and we could obviously go on for hours. I wish Terri was able to make it with us, but this has been really awesome. Thank you, Kedra Herbert and Jocelyn Alter, two of the three co-founders of Dekalb Brilliance Academy. Very excited for y'all to launch this fall and see the fruits of all the labor up to this point. And then the real fun begins, right? You know, now you get to actually do the thing, which is what you've been waiting for and working for. But we appreciate you taking the time and for what you're doing for kids here in Atlanta, and also the example you're setting for folks around the country. So this has been another great session of the Visionary School Founders Series. So we appreciate anybody tuning in. Thank you again, Kedra and Jocelyn. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne.